at one point early in the short story, well, novella, honestly, Empire's Agent, when Rigo is speaking with a law enforcement type from the Republic of Texas, and this law enforcement type finds out that he's not only from Central Europe, but he's also a Roman Catholic, and makes the comment that the people in the Deseret Republic might even not let him in, because he's simply too great a threat to their delicate belief systems. So I don't think there's much trade either in physical goods or even in intellectual ideas in and out of that. The Rocky Mountain Federation is simply a shorthand that exists on paper. There are local strongmen that control, at the tiniest, say, some groups of farms or some groups of ranches, all the way up to, say, the local dictator of Casper, Wyoming. But, again, in the cities of the Front Range of the Rockies, the die-off was pretty bad because they simply couldn't feed themselves. I know very little about the Great Plains. Oklahoma was occupied fairly early on by the Republic of Texas. They needed to expand their food capacity, both in grain and in cattle. And initially the Oklahomans were being threatened by because just as distant as Oklahoma is from Austin, they were just as far away, which is to say just a little too close, from St. Louis, which I'll come to next. And the threats they were getting out of St. Louis is they reached out to the Texans for help. At that point, Texas was nominally setting up its own republic, but law and order was controlled very tightly by the Extraordinary Commission for the Preservation of the Republic, which is also called XCOM, which, as I've said, was run by Clive Barrett, the father of Lillian Calley. And to keep security on the southern border, on the Rio Grande, Clive Barrett ordered the crucifixion of 66,000 criminals, one every 100 feet, taking a page from Marcus Licinius Crassus and the Spartacus Rebellion in, around 70 BC. There were also probably another 5,000 or 8,000 crucified along the Sabine River with Louisiana, because it was his point that a physical wall is only as good as the soldiers behind it. That's something the Romans and the Chinese learned when they built walls. And it was his policy to attack the minds of people trying to cross into the new Texas Republic. And if you think you're going to a better life and you look up and see, oh, that was my cousin who attempted to cross 3 weeks ago, slowly dying without his knees being broken, maybe I'll just go back to Guatemala. Besides the approximately 70 to 80,000 crucified, there were also people in Texas, undesirables, that were simply rounded up, put onto trains, taken to the border, and dropped off. The suggested death toll was 250,000 people in the establishment of the Republic of Texas, and as I'm starting to learn in the manuscript I'm writing now, that does tend to weigh somewhat heavily on these people's children who are moving into politics in their 30s, 40s, in the next generation, that our state was founded in very brutal terms. But getting back to Oklahoma, XCOM basically seized the assets of the Texas National Guard units and occupied Oklahoma, and there was a clash with the mostly light infantry coming out of St. Louis around, it was Topeka, Kansas. And just to let them know what an effective foreign policy looked like, XCOM razed the city to the ground. Turning to St. Louis, I'm not exactly sure how it survived, but it did, because as soon as you get outside the city, you do have a wonderful agrarian hinterland. And what's interesting in a inversion of, say, the Americas of the early 19th century is political power in St. Louis was held by the Black Muslim Brotherhood, who effectively insurfed, if not flat out enslaved, enough of the local whites to keep food coming in. I'm sure in the opening months of the breakup, the casualty rates in St. Louis must have been horrific, but the Black Muslim Brotherhood had enough organization and enough political power to put themselves at the top of the pyramid and stay there for almost 2 generations. It's only in the manuscript I'm writing now, the working title is Imperium Shadow, that we find what ultimately is the fate of St. Louis. And I'm not addressing that right now. The rest of the U.S. Midwest, again, the cities were absolute battlegrounds and died off almost to the last man, woman, and child. Outside of those, the farmers and ranchers closest to the cities like Columbus or Indianapolis or Chicago, those, of course, would have been raided, stripped by the locusts of the city. But then once you've eaten the food that's on the ground, none of these people know the difference between a plow and a rake. So in the first winter, they would have all died. So only far, far outside of the cities was there anything like a level of survival in the American Midwest. Canada had to deal with an influx of U.S. refugees, and I don't know what happened to them. They may have simply been put into work camps. We'll find out someday. Washington, D.C., I'm going to save that for a political discussion, because what happened there, I mean, the Black Muslim Brotherhood in St. Louis is one thing. What happened in Washington, D.C., even to this day, I'm trying to wrap my head around it. The degenerates and deviants that you think we have there now got worse, if you can even imagine that. North of there, from Philadelphia all the way to New York, of course, essentially everyone starved to death, because outside of those cities, there was no way to feed the teeming millions of the corridor from Philadelphia to New York. In the far northeast corner, something arose called the Northern Federation, which was initially Maine and New Hampshire, and then after a couple of purges, for lack of a better term, Vermont and other elements of the upper tier New England states was incorporated as well. And in the podcast that we'll come to about politics on the up East Coast, at one point, Boston was also razed to the ground, utterly destroyed, which is unfortunate because it's a good deep water harbor, but it was a political and ethnic necessity for the Northern Alliance to stay alive. Looking at humanity further afield, Western Europe is pretty much gone and depopulated. I mean, extrapolate from where they are now with their continued importation of barbarians from MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, and more South Africans coming north for a better life. That's simply human nature, and unless you tell these people to stay home or we'll shoot you, they're going to keep coming. And they did. And eventually the lights went out and stayed out. The exception to that was Central and Eastern Europe. Central Europe, as I've mentioned, the Visegrad group of Poland, Czech Republic, isn't it called like Czechia now? I don't know, they shouldn't change their names so often. Slovakia and Hungary are form the Visegrad group now. In the future history, Austria, Croatia, Slovenia, and parts of northern Italy are also brought in, and that's when they decide to call themselves the Habsburg monarchy. And they have very, very strict border controls. East of them, I do mention at one point, oh heavens, which story was it? That Putin was in his 6th or 8th term as president, and by that time, the machines of Tribe Mindrovich, coded in St. Petersburg, awoke. And as I said in the last podcast, one of the things that the first among equals of that tribe did, Rena is her name, is to first take control of the government of Russia and 2, recognizing that monarchy is the natural political state of humanity, tells Putin, all right, you're retiring. She finds the Romanov heir, pops him onto the throne as the new Tsar of all the Russias, but lets them know that political power is in her hands. She may be a machine, she may be an AI, to use the term they don't like, but she said she appreciates being brought into existence by the Russians. A lot of the soul, honestly, of the machines comes from their programmers, from their creators. And so she has the soul of a Russian. Very fatalistic, very determined, very technological is not the right word. Technocratic is almost a better word for that. And so she does, as another machine, Lily's best friend, she does care for her people, the Russians, as a mother cares for her children. But it's a very harsh kind of love. It's, if she says to an entire town, I'm uprooting you and moving you here, well, you go. Because not only does she have political power in her hands, being the machine she is, she can close down all electrical power to your town. She can make the trains stop. So it's a situation I've only learned a little bit about, but she, just like the Empress of Japan, Togame, Reina does do yeoman's work in turning around the Russian demographic implosion. And so to look at a broader picture now, as we're coming up on 30 minutes, is that the Republic of Texas, Faustina's Imperium, basically the old American Deep South, the Russian Empire, and Japan have all reversed demographic decline. And because this will be another podcast as well, but I have to mention it now just to explain, because Earth finds itself in another Maunder minimum. Honestly, right now in the real world, it's estimated it started back in 1999-ish, a dearth of sunspots, and the sun's cooling off. So people in our age right now scream hysterically about global warming, and they're absolute idiots. They have no idea what's actually happening. The Earth is getting cooler. That trend continues into machine civilization, to the point where Siberia is slowly becoming uninhabitable because the snow and ice don't melt in the spring and summer. The northern tier states of Canada are becoming uninhabitable. I have an officer cadet from the Canadian Army in the book I'm writing now say that you can stand atop the skyscrapers of Ottawa and Montreal and look north in your field glasses, and you can see the line of white, and it never goes away, and each year it gets a little closer. As a result of that, the Polar Alliance is created, and now we're edging into politics, but I'm going to wrap things up here in just a moment. And the Polar Alliance is created specifically, there's 4, and later another 5th signatory to it. But of those 4 plus 1, 3 of those nations, the Japanese, the Russians, and then later, as you discover right toward the end of Empress Crusade, Faustina's Imperium, have access to the technology of reactionless motors. And that means that unlike chemical boosters that are so expensive and take so much energy to get mass off of the Earth, is that it's dirt cheap now to go up as it is to go left or right. So the humans don't have to look for land just here on Earth anymore. They can look up at worlds without end. That was a good overview of both the immediate families who inhabit most of my stories, the Barretts, the Hartmanns, and the Rigos, followed by a quick round the U.S., then round the world tour, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Not sure where I'm headed next week. I know I've got to plan this in advance because I'm going to be ricocheting around the country a bit to pick up one of my daughters at an internship way out west. But I will probably begin turning to some of the political happenings. What is exactly the nature of the dictatorship in Portland? what's the relationship of the occupying Mexican army